All right. So we have been studying Paul's journey to Rome. And as we have noticed on our map of his journey, they start of chapter 27. He and Luke, Aristarchus, as well as the centurion, some amount of soldiers, we don't know how many, all together there was 200 and how many? 276 on the boat. We learn that later on here in chapter 17. They leave Caesarea. They take this boat up to, this is Tyre right here, but they take the boat to Sidon. Then they continue. They don't actually stop in Seleucia or Tarsus, but they go around Cyprus and to Myra or Mysia. And this is where the first boat, that's its home port. And so they pick up another boat, an Alexandrian boat, and they are kind of hugging the coast here in between roads. They come to Cnidus, then they come south to Crete. They stop at Lasea, at which point Paul suggests, listen, this is a really bad idea. We really shouldn't go any further. We need to stay here. However, the crew thinks and convince the centurion that we can make it to Phoenix from Fair Havens. So here's Fair Havens. You would think it's just a little tiny bitty, just around the block type of thing to Phoenix. But as they're departing, right, almost soon after they depart Fair Havens, they get caught in Euroclydon, which is a wind, northeast wind. And as a result, they get pushed south. So that's where we are in Acts chapter 27 at the moment. They are in the midst of being caught in this storm. We see starting in verse 16 or so. Yeah, this is about where we stopped last week. So we see, starting in verse 15, when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. They just let the wheel go rather than risk damage to the boat. Running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty, and as Lisa mentioned last week, I looked up that term skiff, and it could be used for a lifeboat, but it was specifically generally used to unload people and crew. It wouldn't have been huge, it wouldn't have been very big, not for enough people for 276 people, but it was enough to be able to land people a little bit at a time onto land, since you couldn't get right up to land in the boat. So, verse 17, when they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship. That's to keep the wooden planks that the ship's made out of from splitting with the waves. They see in verse 17, fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. Rather than weighing anchor and just trying to hold out, especially given the type of boat that they were in, they knew that it was best just to let the wind drive us so that we don't risk any damage and causing it to sink in the middle of the ocean. Verse 18, because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. Then on the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So far, as of verse 19, this is the third day. So verse 18, Luke doesn't get specific in terms of exactly what they've thrown overboard this on the second day. Whatever was handy that might have been heavy to keep from sinking. And so now on the third day, they throw the tackle overboard. I looked up this term as well. And as we talked about last week, we think of tackle, we think of maybe extra tools they may have had, extra materials. And one definition I found also refers to possible furniture. So any furniture that they had that they didn't need, that was on board for some reason, they may have thrown it overboard as well. So in verse 20, now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. So they are somewhere at this point, they're probably somewhere right around here. They passed Clauda, and they're somewhere right about in this area at this point after the third day. And as we get to verse 20, after many days, so many days after that, ultimately we're going to find out how many days total are they in this storm? At least Has anybody read that far yet? 14 days. Yeah, 14 days total they're going to be in this storm. So for 2 weeks at least, okay, depending on where Luke is accounting those days, I'm assuming he's accounting it from the first time they encountered the storm at this point. But this is wherever verse 20 is, they're in this range or so. And Luke says, hope's been given up. Keep in mind that this boat it has basically gotten caught up with this storm. In other words, it's not just driving through it, it's not being pushed away from it, it's being caught in it. And so as the storm moves, the ship moves. And that's why it's being so battered by the storm, is that it's basically trapped inside this storm. So anything through verse 20 thus far. So notice they don't see any sun or stars, so it was hard to tell between night and day because the clouds were so bad, the storm was so bad, that this was the situation that they were in. Anything else through anything through verse 20 so far? Verse 21. After long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. So somewhere between verse 20 and verse 21, we're going to see that Paul's going to reference an angel of the Lord. So whatever communication God had with Paul through this angel, through this vision, took place somewhere between verse 20 and 21. So Paul says, after long abstinence from food, I'm assuming, even though Luke doesn't really explain what that abstinence, the choice from that abstinence of food is, I'm assuming they're wanting to make the food last as long as they can. Okay, that's the only reason I can figure why they were waiting, basically rationing their food. 276 people. This trip's only supposed to take such and such amount of time. They were supposed to stop before they headed on to Italy. Okay, this is the long part of the trip at this point. So keep in mind the intention was to stop in Phoenix before they head over to Italy. But this is the long part. This is the long part of the journey. And so, again, I don't know how long it would have normally taken. Certainly probably not 2 weeks, given the fact that that's what they're in the middle of at this point. So I'm assuming that the abstinence from food here is because they're rationing it. And we're going to find later that they are going to eat. And they're going to throw the rest of it overboard before the shipwrecks. All right. So after long abstinence from food, Paul stands. He says, Men, you should listen to me and not sail from Crete and incur this disaster and loss. Verse 22. Now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. So, angel of the Lord, at some point, and he says, verse 23, there stood by me this night. So at some point, before verse 21, whenever that was that night though, an angel of the Lord appeared to Paul, spoke to him, and relayed a message from God, which was, first of all, that there was not going to be any life lost. Okay, God's going to spare all 276 people. The ship will be lost, and with the ship, cargo, and so forth. But no person's going to lose their life. Specifically, verse 24, this is what the angel says to Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. Remember, what did Jesus say back in Jerusalem, back in Acts chapter 23? Yeah, you're going to testify of me even in Rome. Okay, so Paul knew he wasn't going to die in Jerusalem at that point. He knew eventually he was going to end up in Rome. How exactly that was going to happen, he didn't know quite yet. But at this point, he knows that this is the fulfillment of that. And God's going to make sure he gets to Rome, albeit not the way that they intended, but certainly God's still going to make it where that will happen. Indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you, therefore take heart, men. So this is Paul picking back up in verse 25. Don't be afraid, take heart. Notice this phrase there in verse 25. For I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. despite the storm, despite the situation that they're in, Paul believed. And this kind of speaks to a little bit of one of our bulletin articles that describes trusting in the unknown that we had, I think it was last week, where Noah, even though, as far as we know, he had never seen at least a flood and very possibly never seen rain, because there's a mention in Genesis of the watering of the plants on the earth. There was a dew-like mist that watered them before the flood, it would seem. And Noah, yet, despite the fact he hadn't seen this which God was warning him about, he still acted anyway because he believed God. Same thing with Abraham. Going to this place and that God told him, as well as receiving a son after the age. So all of this speaks to the faith of one, if God says something, I believe it. Now notice here in verse 23, this phrase here that Paul says, there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. What does he mean by that? First of all, we know what it means that he serves. But notice this first part, to whom I belong. In what way does Paul consider himself belonging to God?
He's a child of God.
Okay, he's a child of God. Okay, he's a servant of God. He's a child of God. What does this speak to regarding not so much what God has done, but what Paul has done? Paul's mindset towards God and his service to God, when Paul says, this God to whom I belong, what does that speak to regarding his mind and his thought process regarding Jehovah? Okay, was he living his life for himself? No, he was committed to God, so much so that he considered himself as belonging to God. Okay, this God, I belong to him. I am his. He was born again in baptism. He is a servant. But it's the concept of total commitment, total devotion that Paul displays in this statement. And of course, you see that with the faith that he has, that it will be just as God said it would. Okay, and I think that's an important thought process for you and I to have as well. That when we think about Jehovah and we think about our lives as Christians, that we think of it in terms of, I belong to him. Not just that I'm a child, but that I am completely devoted to him. Yes, ma'am?
Could it be like our family? We belong to our family?
Yeah. In the sense that that relationship that exists, that it exists because, of course, in relation to our physical family, that's because we're related by blood. Okay, in relation to God, I am a part of his family because I follow the truth. That's one of the things that John describes in 1 John chapter 1, that we have fellowship with the Father as we walk in the light because he is in the light. Okay, and as such, I belong to him because he considers me his, as I am obeying the truth as he's told me to. I saw several hands. Yes, ma'am?
You know, he was very specific about that God because of how many idols and stuff that they had.
Yeah?
But also the belonging to, I don't believe anywhere in the Bible we ever hear someone that worshipped an idol saying they belong to that idol.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, meaning that God is a living being and I belong to him.
That's true. That's a good point to make. Yeah, it differentiates that this is rather than a thing can't possess a person, so to speak, whereas the true God possesses his servants and his, for that matter, his children. They belong to him. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Would there be a sense in his immediate audience, the crew would understand belonging to crew of a ship, the owner of the ship, the soldiers are going to understand belonging to the army and all that entails?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there could be a sense in which they would be able to relate to what that means given their individual situations. Yeah. And of course the fact that they're committed to those roles. Whether they were forced into them or they chose them, they were committed in those roles. And certainly Paul's describing his commitment as well. Lisa?
Well, and they also understood belonging to because they were still slaves.
Sure. Yeah. And Paul, on several occasions, refers to himself as being not only a servant, but also a slave of God. Not that God has forced him into, but that's the contrast, was that he willingly submitted himself to. And that's a big distinction to make. Yeah. All right. Anything else through verse 25? And I think it's interesting, too, because notice from Luke's perspective. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not necessarily saying that he thinks that Paul has given up hope. Okay? Remember what Jesus said in Jerusalem. Paul, you're going to testify of me in Rome. Okay? To me, when Luke writes this in verse 20, Luke's speaking for himself and perhaps maybe the majority of the people on the ship, which is to say the sailors and the soldiers, but at least Paul, and whether Paul had relayed this information to Luke and Aristarchus, I don't know, but at least Paul knew to some extent for Jesus' words to be true, we're going to have to survive, or somehow some of us are going to have to survive, because I still have to get to Rome. Jesus said that's what's going to happen. So I think when Luke says this, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up, I think he's speaking at the very broadest, everybody except for those who were Christians. Okay? And possibly if Luke and Aristarchus and whoever else may have been with Paul, if they didn't know about the words of Jesus in Jerusalem to Paul, then I may also say, oh, this is it. This is God's will. We're done. But Paul, at the very least, I'm confident, hadn't given up hope, because he'd been told by Jesus what was going to happen. Anything else through verse 25? Which speaks to also the purpose for why an angel of the Lord was sent in the beginning. Okay, to talk to Paul and to let him know, not so much maybe for Paul, but notice when he says in verse 22, I urge you to take heart. Okay, I tend to think this wasn't so much for Paul as it was for everybody else. Okay, this message to Paul, again, Paul, the implication of what Jesus told him already suggested Paul was going to survive. But it seems like this message is really more for the rest of them. And certainly, it shows forth the power of God, doesn't it? Okay, in that no one, not a single person is going to lose their life, and then, as we're going to see, not a single person did. And we'll talk more about what all was involved in that here in a minute. But that's certainly going to carry weight when they get to Malta, that all 276 people are still alive. They're going to look back on what Paul said, and he said he saw an angel, and an angel said, you're all going to be fine. That's going to carry weight in showing the power of God. Lisa?
Yeah, when they talked about all hope had been given up, that should be a lesson for us, that when people lose their faith or turn from God, it's not like a switch went off. That was a process. Even though it only took 14 days, they still started out hopeful, and then that hope went down, down, down.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, just as human beings, we can say, okay, am I hopeful? Am I faithful?
Right.
And check ourselves to be sure that we're more like Paul than the other 200 and some people on that boat.
Well, and when you think about, by the end of it, 14 total nights, that sometimes things are not resolved in the time frame that you would like for them to. You kind of think in terms of, we pray about it, we give it to God, and sometimes after a week has gone by, we're still hoping that God will be able to resolve it in some form or fashion that will bring about a good resolution. And then maybe 2 weeks pass, 3 weeks pass, 4 weeks pass, and it's still one of those loose threads, and it's kind of just hanging over your head. Things aren't resolved on our schedule. They're resolved on God's schedule. And at least in many times that I can look back, and I know many of you sure can too, it often seems like it's at the last possible moment. You think there's no way this is going to get worked out, at least not in a good way. And at the last possible moment, somehow, some way, things just happen to work out. And I really do tend to think that that's God reminding us that I'm in charge, and you need to trust me because I know what I'm doing. You don't. Debbie?
Dawn how uplifting this would have been for Paul, because while Paul knows Christ told him he's going to be there, he's been with these people for several days.
Mm-hmm.
You know he's not sitting there silent. I mean,
You wouldn't think so.
worshiping God,
Yeah.
He's teaching, he's singing, he's doing these things.
Sure.
And as long as there's life, there's hope.
Yeah.
And I mean, just imagine the profound impact this had on the lives of everybody on that ship.
Yeah.
Knowing when Paul says, you know, the God that I serve,
Yeah.
you know, this is what he told me and stuff. I mean, I just can imagine the impact that had on those people the rest of their lives. And if they're, you know, like a group of almost you persuade me to be a Christian, you know that gave them something to think about.
Well, and you got to figure, I hadn't even thought about this before, but you got to figure that all of these Gentile people who had their own gods, surely they were calling upon their gods to save them. Okay. Yeah, and not getting an answer. Okay, but then for Paul to stand up to make the distinction, the God that I serve, this is what he has revealed to me. Now, some of them may have thought, Paul, you haven't eaten in however many days. This is after a long absence for food. Some of them may not have believed immediately or been convinced that what Paul saw was real, but certainly by the time they get to Malta and everybody's still alive and it happened exactly the way the angel said it would, they're certainly going to believe. So, yeah, that distinction from your gods aren't saving you, however, the one true God can and will, because that's what he said he's going to do. So yeah, that's a point that's going to have an impact on them. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if there's a lesson in here for us about how to teach today, because you know there's a lot of people walking around that say they serve the same God that we do. So is there a lesson in here for us? The Bible that I read, you know, I'm not sure. I'm just kind of talking as I think here, but it's screaming to me that I need to learn from this about how to study with people.
Well, and to explain the one true God. You know, we talked last week, Sunday night, about you shall not have any other gods before me. And one of the things we talked about was a false God isn't just necessarily an idol or an image, but it can also be an overlaying of characteristics that you have chosen for God. And you're imposing them on Jehovah. Like people saying that Allah is the same God as Jehovah when he's not. The way Allah is depicted is not the same as Jehovah. This is a completely different God. Well, the same thing can happen even in Christianity. Okay, people overlaying characteristics or thought process concepts, words that God never said, concepts that God has never taught, and they kind of force God into the box that they want him to be in, that becomes a false God for them. This is the God I want to serve, not the God that actually is. Okay, so yeah, in a lot of ways, there's a relationship there of recognizing the one whom I belong, or to whom I belong, and to whom I serve, is a recognition that it doesn't matter how I view Jehovah, Jehovah is. Okay, I can lie to myself, I can deceive myself, I can choose not to read portions of his word, but in the end, Jehovah is Jehovah, and nothing's going to change that. Paul, he was completely submissive to that Jehovah, to that God, and what God had said. Paul wasn't attempting to change him or to show him in a different light or present him differently. He completely submitted to him. So yeah, I guess you could make that parallel there, in that when people hold to characteristics or ideas about God that aren't true, that aren't what the Bible says, in essence, they are worshiping a false God, a God that they've created, not the God of the Bible. Yeah. Anything else through verse 25? Yes, sir.
I think at this point, Paul's credibility is it's going to need to be established later on.
Sure.
When they're about to run aground and the soldiers want to kill the prisoners.
Yep.
And the centurion wants to save Paul.
Right.
This probably came to his mind when he was making the decision, the centurion, I mean.
Yeah.
This guy he's serving a powerful God. You don't want to run
Sure.
afoul of him.
Absolutely. You know, and not only that, but You think about Acts chapter 17 when Paul and Silas were in Philippi and they were in prison and they were singing hymns, right? And I think somebody mentioned already that no doubt during this period of time that Paul and Luke and Aristarchus, whoever else is with them, that they're likely doing the same thing now. Okay, I don't see how that would have changed. Praying, singing hymns, Paul possibly teaching about the gospel. The centurion already has some sort of relationship with Paul. There's a friendly viewing of the centurion to Paul already from earlier that we saw in chapter 27. That he gave him liberty when they got to Sidon, allowed him to see the saints there and so forth. So there's already, Paul set himself apart from everybody else. And again, some of that may have to do with the fact that he's not your traditional prisoner. Okay, this is a Roman citizen. There's nothing specific going on. Maybe he knows that. But still, when you get down into chapter 27, towards the end of chapter 27, that relationship is going to be a key component of how the centurion reacts to what's happening. Yeah. Anything else through verse 25? Yes, Nolan?
Just thinking back a minute, you referenced the abstinence, the time, not only not eating, but the days and nights that are passing and going on. That this certainly is going to come out, hopefully, a matter of faith for all these who are observing. But that same period of time is going to be a testing of our faith, or those that are believers. You think back to the showdown on Mount Carmel.
Yeah.
Could God have, first minute made something? No. Those guys got to stay out there all day.
That's true.
Calling and doing all this. And then when it was time,
yeah,
God shows himself.
If Baal is truly a god, surely he's hearing what you're doing, and maybe he's just using the restroom. Just give it time. Yeah.
And in the waiting, as we said, hope's dying, and it's a test of our faith also.
Yeah.
We had faith at the beginning. Are we going to have it at the end?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. To Elijah, Mount Carmel, and several occasions even after and before that of God proving himself as being more powerful. You think about the Ark of the Covenant versus Dagon, one of the gods of the Philistines. God consistently showed himself to be the only God, the true God. And this, certainly the text would seem to support the fact that God is doing it again, especially in light of these men who likely were worshipers of either the Greek or Roman gods. Anything else through verse 25 and 26? All right, so verse 26, we must run aground on a certain island. Of course, we know what that's going to be. It's going to be Malta. And what Paul says on a certain island, I don't think Paul said Malta. I think God says we're going to have to run aground on an island. And so they're going to figure out where they are later. But that's what Paul acknowledges here in verse 26. So in verse 27, now when the 14th night had come, so for 14 days, that they, as we were driven up and down, okay, when I read this verse 27, this isn't 14 days since they left Caesarea. This is 14 days since they've been caught in this storm. Okay, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near to some land. Now, sailors, and depending on your person's specific job, if they're well trained in it, a lot of times they can develop an instinct with it. Sailors have always been superstitious anyway, but for whatever reason, especially sailors who spend a lot of time at sea, and some theories are, well, somehow or another, the way the sound echoes in the ocean, that when you get close to land, really experienced sailors can tell a difference, that the sound is different in some form or fashion. They sensed that they were getting close. However they did that, certainly that speaks to their experience, which also suggests that they knew better, and they did, than sailing when they did. They knew better, but they thought they could make it. They didn't. Paul said, I told you. So the Adriatic, this is technically the Adriatic Sea. What Luke's describing here is right in this corridor right in here. Okay, this is the Mediterranean. Technically, all of this is considered the Mediterranean, but this Adriatic Sea kind of extends. That's what's being described here. So this part right here is what Luke's describing during that this full 14 days since they got caught in this storm off Lasea. This part right here, they've been driven all up through here. That's why you've got all these. This is not the GPS, by the way, of Paul's ship. This is just whoever drew this map. They're saying this is kind of like what the course would have been. They could have gone a little bit north without even realizing it. I mean, but in the end, they're going to end up in Malta. So, picking up back in verse 27, about midnight the sailors sensed they were drawing near some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. Anybody know how long a fathom is? 6 feet. Okay. Literally, the term fathom, it means width of your arms. Okay, with the width of arms is the idea. And so, generally speaking, from the tip of your fingers to the other tip of your other fingers, it's about 6 feet, between 5.5 and 6 feet. So they started out 20 fathoms, which is how many feet? 120. And then they went a little bit further. They're already thinking we're getting closer to some land here. They took soundings. They found it to be 15. So they went from 120 feet to how many feet? 90? Okay. And so that which shows that they're getting closer to something, right? And we see in verse 29, then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Okay, so I don't know exactly what the draft of one of these boats would have been. 276 people plus cargo, ballast, and all that stuff. I don't know how deep that would be, but past 90 feet, they're starting to get concerned that we're going to start hitting stuff. So however deep that they said that this is the line we can't cross here before we start hitting things and start sinking. This is why they cast anchors, 4 anchors. So again, we talked about what the size of the ship may have been. And again, from just archaeology and so forth, at least in terms of how it was built, they didn't have a cargo hold like you think of in, when I think of ships and cargo holds, I think of Swiss Family Robinson. Okay, and you got those grates and stuff that you close over. These would have been fairly open, at least what evidence that I've seen. So waves and such, you had to be very careful with how that came over. How big it would have been, well, they had 4 anchors. Okay, however big that would have had to have been for 4 anchors. But they dropped 4 anchors at the stern. They prayed for day to come because you don't want to try to risk your life in the middle of the night, in the storm. Somebody's going to die. So they waited for day to come. Verse 30, as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. So, the sailors, and it doesn't necessarily say specifically in verse 30 what time this was. We're going to see later on in verse 33, dawn's coming. So, whatever time this was, these guys are thinking, we're going to bail. Okay, so the sailors think that they're close enough to be able to make it in the skiff. However many sailors there were. Again, I don't know what these numbers would have been, the division of sailors to soldiers to passengers to prisoners, all this stuff. But these sailors, or at least some portion of them, they're planning on leaving. But they're doing it under the pretense of, hey, we're going to go out here and we're going to drop some more anchors. We'll see ya. And then in verse 31, Paul, somehow he knew what was going on. He told the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Why would Paul say that?
Maybe it was the skill of the sailors.
Okay.
And the passengers wouldn't have been able to handle the vessel.
Okay, that could be. That could be.
Something in what the angel told me.
I tend to think that, and it was probably because of that part of the providence involved in this is that these sailors needed to be on board to help steer the ship, because that's what we're going to see here in a little while. But when God said, or when God told Paul that, listen, he's going to make sure that everybody's alive, everybody's going to be fine. I get the sense, though, that God's going to save us all at the same time. Okay, not a little bit, have however many, 40 or 50, on this way, and all at the same time. So when we end up all in the water, we're all going to be saved together. And if that doesn't happen, that's what Paul says. Unless these men stay in the ship, you can't. He doesn't say we can't. And I find that interesting. Whatever Paul may have known, what other dialogue God may have had through this angel with Paul, Paul says you cannot be saved. And I tend to think that Paul was confident that at the very least, he would still end up in Rome, one way or the other.
He might have been telling him that he wasn't going to be responsible for him.
And that could be, if you're not going to listen, this is what my God said, and if you're going to allow this to take place, you're on your own type of thing. That could be. So we see in verse 32, and I'm assuming the centurion told the soldiers, even though Luke doesn't record it. I don't know that the soldiers would have done this without the authority of the centurion telling them to. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. I want you to think about how dramatic a choice or decision to do this is. Okay? For all intents and purposes, this is literally their only lifeboat. Okay? At the very least, out of the 276 people, some people might be able to get on this thing and get off, get away. All right? To cut the ropes, hey, either we're all going down together or we're all going to be saved together. That's really what this boiled down to. We're not letting the sailors off to get off and try to save themselves. Ultimately, I doubt the skiff could have survived, given how terrible these winds and waves were. I doubt they would have worked anyway. But the soldiers, again, I'm presuming verse 32, the soldiers didn't just up and say, oh, hey, let's cut the ropes. I'm assuming the centurion, even if he was silent when they went to do it, there was some sense of authority there that the centurion allowed that to take place. That being the case, there was a lot of trust, presumably, in what Paul said by the centurion, and for that matter, by the soldiers. Okay? Paul makes this statement, and all of a sudden, the centurion and the soldiers are cutting their only life raft off the boat. Okay, that to me, that's pretty dramatic. That's a pretty big, substantial leap of faith, I guess you could say. If it's the centurion who's making these choices, then that's a pretty big deal. Anything through verse 32? Yes, ma'am.
New American Standard says you yourselves cannot be saved. Not just you cannot, but you yourselves. In other words, Paul's like, I'll be saved, but you won't be saved.
Yeah. You're taking your own, you're on your own if you do this or allow this to happen. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else through verse 32?
That also lets them know that God's hand is in them being saved.
That's right. That's right. This isn't just because the sailors on their own decided with their smarts to get off their lifeboat, on the lifeboat and sail away.
Does that probably make sense as a sailor to do that?
Well, I mean, it's
a possibility.
Well, they've already dropped anchor, and so at this point, what are we going to do? How are we going to save ourselves? Right. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
The other thing, cutting that boat away means that wherever they end up, they're going to have to swim.
That's right.
Because there's no way to get
Which-
a non-swimmer from the boat to the land without another boat.
That's right. And you got to figure that their chances would have been a lot better with a life raft or a lifeboat of some kind, but the fact that they're all going to have to swim to shore is going to speak even more to the providence of God saving all of them. It's not like, 50 of them showed up in a boat. Well, that was easy for you guys, No, God saved every single one of them. Anything else in verse 32?
See, start of some faith growing here.
Yeah, you do. You do from the centurion, and possibly even, again, I don't know exactly how much these soldiers are, what kind of relationship Paul's creating with the soldiers, but at the very least, the centurion. And these soldiers are seeing that kind of build before their eyes, this relationship between the centurion and Paul. Yeah. All right. We'll be able to start this a little bit before the bell rings. As day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food. Again, how many how they rationed this food off during these 14 days of the storm. Again, I'm assuming that they were trying to kind of spread it out so that they wouldn't run out of food just in case, they needed it. But he implored them all to take food. Let's eat. Let's all, whatever the rations were, let's all take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. So now that I read that out loud, verse 33, first time I read through that, it didn't connect in my head that they've gone 14 days without food, 14 full days without food. So that's interesting, verse 33. They continued without food and eaten nothing for 14 days. And weak, yeah, weak, nauseated, yeah, man, trying to eat and all that, oh man, I don't, you know what? Yeah, that's the last thing you want to do. That's right. Is that reading the same with everybody else? Because I didn't read it that way when I was going through this studying it. But today's the 14th day you have waited, continued without. Is that 14 days without food? Is that right for everybody? I'm not reading that wrong, Ben?
I don't know, the way I was thinking was during the storm or whatever, maybe the food got washed away. They just didn't have anything.
Well, they had some because they're going to throw the rest of it overboard. But yeah, some of it may have gone over. Some of it may have spoiled. Again, keep in mind, without having like a literal underdeck for the cargo, all that water's coming in and out. We know they have wheat and bread because they're going to toss the rest of it overboard here in a little bit. So yeah, some of it may have spoiled. Wet, soggy bread, who wants to eat that? So there may have been some spoilage going on. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, so this boat isn't a cruise liner.
No.
So, and you have to think about this. If you've never been on a boat in Whitewater, you're hanging on. You don't have a hand to eat with.
Yeah.
Because you're going to get pitched over.
Yeah, that's true.
Everything's slamming. If it's not tied down, it's going from one side to the other. And you're just hanging on for dear life.
For dear life. And can you imagine 14 days of this? 14 days of this. This is not a cruise that you want to be on. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 33 and 34 next Sunday. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.